Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. We're so glad you're here. Before we dive into today's incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far our community reaches. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new adventure. We've got something special lined up for tomorrow, and you won't want to miss it. Now sit back, relax, and let's jump into today's story. What happens when you disrespect a royal guard? The shocking consequences. It was a warm, sunny afternoon just outside the iconic Buckingham Palace. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass from the nearby royal gardens, and a light breeze danced through the streets. Tourists from all over the world gathered around, eagerly, waiting for the daily Queen's Guard ceremony, a centuries-old tradition that attracts visitors year-round. Among the crowd stood Mark Dawson, a proud and disciplined soldier of the Queen's Guard. His uniform, a bright red jacket, gleamed under the sun, and his posture was as rigid and straight as the palace walls behind him. His eyes remained fixed, forward, a sign of the unwavering self-control he had honed over 8 years of service in the army. Mark was not just any soldier. He had earned the right to wear that uniform. He wasn't simply a ceremonial figure for tourists to take photos with. No, he was a combat veteran, someone who had been tested in battle and emerged with a sense of duty and pride that few could understand. But today he would face a challenge, not from the enemy but from a rude tourist who seemed to think that these soldiers were little more than statues. The peace of the moment was broken by a loud, sarcastic voice. "These guys are seriously still doing this statue thing." The voice belonged to Ethan Walker, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his ignorance. He pushed his way through the crowd, a perfect image of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. His expensive shirt and designer sunglasses set him apart from the rest of the visitors. He looked like he spent more time at fancy gyms than in real challenging situations. As he approached, Ethan's eyes locked onto Mark, and with a sneer, he started to mock the soldier's rigid stance. "Look at this bloke," he announced, loudly to anyone who would listen, standing there like a model from the olden days. He then pointed at Mark's perfectly groomed mustache. "And look at that mustache. Is this some sort of joke?" His voice grew louder, deliberately, trying to draw attention and make the crowd uncomfortable. A few tourists around him nervously laughed, but most just shuffled away, sensing the trouble Ethan was causing. Mark, however, didn't flinch. He stood tall, eyes forward, completely unmoved by the taunts. His mustache, a proud symbol of the regiment he served, was a part of his identity, carefully trimmed and styled to perfection. It wasn't just facial hair, it was a symbol of honor and history, earned through sacrifice and bravery. As the sun reflected off the brass buttons of his uniform, the scene was almost picture perfect, but Ethan, ever the troublemaker, wasn't done yet. "Hey you," Ethan called out, taking another step closer to Mark. "Is that thing real, or did they just stick it on for the tourists?" His voice dripped with mockery, hoping to provoke a reaction. A few people laughed awkwardly, unsure of how to respond to the uncomfortable situation. An older couple standing nearby shook their heads, clearly understanding the significance of what was happening. A young mother, with her kids in tow, whispered a quiet warning about respect as she led them away. From the scene, Ethan wasn't backing down. "You know what really annoys me?" he continued, his voice growing sharper. "Back home, our soldiers actually do something. They're not just ornaments for tourists. But here you are, with your fancy hat and that silly mustache, playing soldiers while real heroes protect the world." As he got closer to Mark, he deliberately invaded the soldier's personal space, trying to provoke him even more. Despite the insults and the invasion of his personal space, Mark remained still, his posture unwavering. The tension in the air was palpable, but it wasn't fear. It was a quiet, controlled power that came from years of real combat experience. His eyes never moved, his expression unreadable, and yet there was something in the way he stood, something that suggested he had faced far greater challenges than an obnoxious tourist. At this point, the crowd had become tense. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the escalating situation. Others kept their eyes on Mark, witnessing how he handled the harassment with such grace and discipline. Ethan, however, wasn't finished. He grinned as he saw the unease spreading through the crowd. "What's wrong, everyone? Scared the toy soldier might come to life?" He sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He leaned in even closer to Mark, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. "Let's see how real that mustache is, eh?" And that was when something changed. The crowd was now completely silent, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Mark stood there as still as ever, his eyes locked forward. Ethan, still inches from him, smiled smugly, thinking he had the upper hand. He was so focused on provoking a reaction that he didn't notice the slight shift in the soldier's posture, the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. Mark was no longer the soldier on display for tourists to admire, no longer just part of the scenery. He had lived a life far more complex than Ethan could ever imagine. In his mind, he wasn't just standing guard in front of the palace. He was a protector, a warrior who had faced battlefields and danger that Ethan would never understand. And this pathetic, childish taunting was nothing compared to what Mark had endured. Ethan took another step forward, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue, or is the soldier finally going to speak up? I bet you're just waiting for your moment to say boo and scare all the tourists, huh?" His laugh was loud, arrogant, cutting through the quiet. He was getting desperate now, hoping that Mark would finally snap, hoping for any sign of weakness, any crack in his armor. But nothing came. The air was thick with expectation, the onlookers now fully aware of the standoff unfolding before them. The sound of a camera clicking echoed, followed by hushed murmurs from the crowd. They were waiting for something. A dramatic moment. A confrontation. Just as Ethan's grin began to widen, thinking he had won, Mark's head shifted slightly. His eyes, which had been fixed ahead, now moved to meet Ethan's gaze. The change was subtle, but it was enough. In that brief moment, Ethan felt something in the air change, something cold and heavy. He'd underestimated the soldier, and now the situation was shifting. With deliberate calm, Mark finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "You seem to think you're funny." The words, though simple, carried weight. The crowd held its breath, anticipating what would come next. Mark's tone didn't waver. There was no hint of anger, only the quiet power of someone who had been in far worse situations and survived. "But what you don't understand," he continued, his eyes never leaving Ethan's, "is that respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn." Ethan blinked, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected words. It wasn't the angry outburst he was hoping for. It wasn't the dramatic scene he'd envisioned. Mark's voice, though calm, was like a quiet storm, brewing in the distance. Ethan, for the first time, felt a flicker of unease. He wasn't the one in control anymore. Mark took a step forward, just enough to close the space between them. "I've seen things you'll never understand, and I've given my life to something far greater than your mockery." He paused, his gaze still unwavering. "You might think it's all a joke, but I stand here today because of the sacrifices made before me. The people who came before me, who wore this uniform, who fought, bled, and died to keep you safe. You might see a toy soldier in front of you, but I am no joke. And neither is this uniform." The crowd had grown so silent, you could hear the rustling of leaves from the nearby trees. Ethan's confident posture wavered as Mark's words sank in. For the first time, he realized he had pushed too far. Mark wasn't just a soldier in ceremonial dress. He was a man who had fought real battles, a man who stood not for himself but for something much bigger. The weight of the words hung in the air, and Ethan's bravado faltered. He opened his mouth, trying to recover, to make another cutting remark. But this time, the words caught in his throat. Mark's presence was too strong, too commanding. And as he stood there, unshaken, the crowd began to shift. People were starting to realize just how much respect Mark deserved, and the admiration in their eyes grew. Ethan's smile had faded, replaced by a nervous twitch at the corner of his lips. He knew deep down that the game was over. He had pushed a man to his limit, and he wasn't sure what would happen next. But as Mark continued to stand tall, the soldier's unspoken power was evident to everyone watching. Mark had earned his place, not just in that uniform, but in the respect of every person who had witnessed his unwavering strength. For a long moment, the two men stood face to face, neither one moving. It was a silent battle of wills, and as the seconds passed, Ethan's shoulders slumped ever so slightly. The crowd was no longer watching the spectacle of a tourist messing with a soldier. They were watching the realization of what true strength really looked like. And that's when Mark spoke again, his voice quieter now, but carrying a weight that could not be ignored. Respect is something you can't force. It's something you earn, and you, Ethan, have a long way to go. With those final words, Mark turned his attention back to his post, resuming his stoic position. Ethan stood frozen, realizing too, late the price of arrogance. The minutes that followed felt like hours. The crowd remained utterly silent, almost holding its collective breath. Ethan stood there, frozen, his bravado shattered. He was no longer the cocky tourist with a sharp tongue. Mark's words had landed harder than he ever could have imagined. But it wasn't just Mark's words that struck him. It was the way he stood, unmoving, a quiet force of nature. It was clear now that this soldier was not someone to be toyed with. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he fumbled for something to say. But the words were gone, lost in the heavy silence that hung between them. His mouth opened, closed, and then opened again. But nothing came out. His mind raced, trying to regroup, to find some way to salvage the situation. But nothing he could say would undo what had just happened. Mark didn't even glance back at him. He didn't need to. He knew Ethan's pride had taken the hardest hit. That was the beauty of it. The soldier didn't need to fight. His strength was in his stillness, in his discipline, in the quiet, unwavering commitment to his role. He wasn't just standing guard for the tourists. He was a living monument to something greater, a representation of all the sacrifices, the lives, the battles fought in the name of duty and honor. For a brief moment, Ethan looked around at the crowd that had gathered. They weren't looking at him anymore. The excitement in their eyes had shifted. They weren't amused by his antics. They were now watching Mark, silently respecting him, acknowledging his strength. The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had failed, not just in his attempt to mock the soldier, but in failing to understand the power of what Mark represented. Still, a part of him refused to give in. The arrogant side of him refused to walk away without a fight. He had to say something, anything. Finally, he found his voice, but it was weaker, hesitant. "All right, I get it," he muttered. But there was no real conviction in his tone. It was as if he were trying to convince himself as much as Mark. "You're some kind of hero, right? Big deal." But Mark didn't respond. He didn't need to. He wasn't here to argue or win a verbal sparring match. His eyes were forward once again, watching for any potential threat or disruption, his focus never wavering. His silence was his response, and it was a response Ethan couldn't argue with. The crowd, too, seemed to sense the finality of the moment. A few people nodded in quiet acknowledgement, some even whispering among themselves. Their conversations no longer centered around Ethan's joke, but about the soldier's unwavering composure. A few tourists were even snapping pictures, capturing the stillness that had enveloped Mark's figure. The soldier was a symbol, silent, powerful, unbreakable, and Ethan had just seen that power up close, felt its weight. Ethan swallowed hard, a knot forming in his throat. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to regain control, how to restore some semblance of dignity. But it was already too late. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him now, not with admiration, but with pity. They weren't looking at the arrogant tourist anymore. They were looking at a boy who had tried to challenge a force much greater than himself, and had failed. Mark remained standing tall, unmoved by the drama unfolding around him. He wasn't seeking any form of validation. He didn't need applause or praise. His role here was clear, and he had done what he needed to do. His strength was in his calm, in his quiet dedication, and in his ability to hold his ground, no matter But it was a lesson that Ethan, for all his bravado, was only beginning to understand. Respect, discipline, honor. These weren't just words to Mark. They were a way of life, a commitment, and it was something Ethan couldn't grasp in a single moment of conflict. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan finally broke the silence, but this time, his voice was different. It was quieter, almost resigned. I don't know what. I was thinking. Mark's gaze flickered just enough to acknowledge the shift in Ethan's tone, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The conversation was over, and in that quiet final exchange, Mark had already won. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the effect of the encounter lingered in the air. Ethan walked away, his head lowered, the weight of his actions pressing on him. He had learned a hard lesson that day. But it wasn't just about respecting the soldier. It was about realizing that there were forces in the world, far stronger and more enduring than any joke or taunt. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Ethan's steps were slow, as if the weight of the day had settled deep into his bones. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their pity and judgment still hanging in the air. But it wasn't that which gnawed at him. No, it was something deeper, something more unsettling. The encounter with Mark had shaken him to his core, in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just that he'd lost face. It was that, for the first time in his life, he had truly felt small, insignificant. As he walked away, the streets of the city suddenly felt endless, stretching out in front of him, offering no escape from the thoughts swirling in his mind. He had spent years building up this persona, this confident, fearless, take-no-prisoners attitude. And now it felt like it had all been a facade, a mask that had cracked in an instant, exposing him for what he truly was. A boy who had no idea what real strength meant. Ethan's hand went to his pocket, and he pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up as he scrolled aimlessly. He didn't know why he kept scrolling. It wasn't like he was going to find any answers there. His social media was flooded with pictures of people enjoying themselves, living carefree lives, sharing moments of joy. None of it mattered anymore. None of it could fill the empty space that had opened up inside him. The reality of his encounter with Mark hit him harder than any insult ever could. It wasn't just about the soldier being stoic. It wasn't just about the way he stood, unflinching, unmoving despite Ethan's best attempts to provoke him. No, what hurt the most was the understanding that Mark didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to fight, to argue, to even respond. He simply was, and that alone made him more powerful than any brash tourist who thought he could come in and shake things up. It was then that Ethan noticed something. A small park bench just off to the side, tucked away from the busy path. He hesitated for a moment, his feet almost instinctively taking him toward it. He sat down, the cold metal of the bench biting through his jeans. The noise of the city seemed distant here, muffled. It was a strange sensation, feeling so disconnected from the world around him, but it was exactly what he needed. The minutes stretched on, and as he sat there, the weight of the day became almost suffocating. Mark's words, and his silence, echoed in his mind. You can't mock strength, not like this. Not if you don't understand it. It was clear. Now that Ethan had been playing with fire, Mark hadn't just been a soldier standing at attention. He had been a teacher, a mentor without even knowing it. A symbol of the quiet, unspoken kind of power that Ethan had never truly understood. The world around him began to shift, the edges of his self-perception blurring. He had spent so much time trying to prove himself to others, to be the loudest, the boldest, the most daring. But what had that gotten him? A laugh? A fleeting sense of satisfaction? Now here he was, sitting alone, miles away from where he had started the day, questioning everything. Ethan stood up abruptly, the motion sharp and sudden. He couldn't sit there any longer. The feelings swirling in him were becoming overwhelming. The anger was gone, replaced by something more complicated, something deeper. He didn't even know what it was, but whatever it was, he knew he needed to face it. He needed to find a way to reconcile the person he had been with the person he was becoming. The city hadn't stopped moving around him, but he had stopped moving within it. He paused and took a deep breath. For the first time all day, his thoughts were clear. He understood now that strength wasn't about how loudly you could shout or how fiercely you could fight. It was about knowing when to stand still, when to listen, when to absorb the world around you without the need for constant noise. Ethan looked back toward the direction he had come from, his eyes searching, but Mark was gone. The soldier had long since resumed his position, still as stone. Ethan stood for a moment watching, but there was no anger now, no need for validation. Just a quiet, reluctant respect. As he turned and began walking away again, he couldn't shake the feeling that something in him had shifted permanently. Mark had taught him more in a few minutes than anyone else ever had. The lesson wasn't about strength, it was about humility. About knowing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let go of your ego, sit quietly, and learn. For the first time, Ethan felt a strange peace settle over him. And as he stepped back into the crowd, he wasn't the same person who had walked in. Something had changed, and maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand what it meant to truly grow. Ethan continued walking, his steps slow, measured. The quiet hum of the city was like a distant soundtrack to his thoughts, but they were louder now, more insistent. The anger that had flared up earlier had burned itself out, leaving behind an odd emptiness that felt both freeing and terrifying. He wanted to leave it all behind, to walk away from the memories of Mark's impassive stare, from the echo of his own insecurities. But something inside him held him back, like a rope tied tight around his chest. He hadn't expected Mark to get under his skin like this. It was as if every word, every movement of the soldier had carved something into his soul. Ethan had always believed that people were what they made of themselves, that the world owed you something if you were bold enough to claim it. But now he wasn't so sure. The harsh truth settled over him like a heavy cloak, cold and suffocating. He had been playing a game he didn't understand. He reached a corner and stopped, the neon signs flickering in front of him. The lights of the city blinked like eyes watching him, but he wasn't looking at them. His mind was far away, replaying the scene with Mark over and over. Why had the soldier's silence cut so deep? Why hadn't he fought back? Why hadn't he said something, anything to prove he was just like Ethan? Human, flawed, ready to engage in a battle of egos? But Mark hadn't needed to fight. He hadn't needed to say anything. His stillness had been more powerful than any words could have been. Ethan had come in with all his bravado, expecting to challenge, expecting a show. But instead he had been met with an unshakable calm. That had been Mark's strength, the ability to stand firm in the face of chaos. And that made Ethan feel small. The bitterness that had started to churn in his stomach came back with a vengeance. How had he allowed himself to become so focused on the surface of things? To get so wrapped up in being loud, in being noticed, that he had missed the deeper truth right in front of him? He wasn't sure. The weight of everything seemed to be pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. It was like he was suffocating on the realization that he had been living a lie, and now he didn't know how to fix it. And then, just as suddenly as the storm inside him had begun, it stopped. The flood of thoughts slowed. The rapid heartbeat calmed. For a split second, Ethan stood there in the silence of the city, as if waiting for something to happen. He wasn't sure what that something was, but it was as though the universe was holding its breath right alongside him. That's when he heard it, footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate. For a moment, Ethan didn't move. His body tensed, muscles stiffened instinctively. Could it be Mark? He didn't know why, but the thought made his heart race. The last thing he wanted was to have another confrontation. He wasn't sure if he could handle another encounter like the one earlier. He turned slowly, half expecting to see a familiar face. But it wasn't Mark. It was a figure he didn't recognize. Someone from the crowd, perhaps just another stranger, walking the streets at night. The man looked at him for a brief moment, then walked on, not giving Ethan a second thought. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The tension in his chest slowly eased. But then it struck him. Why had he even cared? The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. He had been so wrapped up in his own internal struggle, in his own need for validation, that he had been blind to what truly mattered. Mark hadn't been trying to prove anything to him. He had simply existed in his own truth, undeterred by the noise of the world. And that, Ethan realized, was the lesson he had missed the first time. It wasn't about fighting or proving who was stronger or louder. It was about the quiet confidence to just be, to not need anyone's approval, to not need to dominate every conversation or situation, to simply stand there, knowing your worth without having to shout about it. Ethan's heart began to beat a little steadier as he thought about it. There was a new fire in him now, not the kind that burned hot and quick, but the kind that smoldered quietly, steadily. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone. Not Mark, not the city, and certainly not to himself anymore. The way forward seemed clearer now. It wasn't about fighting the world. It was about understanding it. The need to make noise, to rise above others had lost its appeal. What Mark had taught him in his quiet strength had shattered that illusion. Ethan didn't need to play the game. He didn't need to keep pretending. With newfound clarity, he started walking again, but this time he wasn't running away from anything. He was simply moving forward. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt free. Hey, thanks so much for watching. I'd love to hear what you think about the story so far. Do you think Ethan made the right choice? How would you have handled the situation with Mark? Is there a lesson in this story that resonates with you? Maybe you've been through something similar, or maybe you have a completely different perspective. Either way, your thoughts really matter, and I'd love to read them. This channel isn't just about watching videos. It's about building a community where we can share experiences and learn from each other. So don't be shy. Drop a comment below, share your opinion, and let's keep the conversation going. And hey, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. That way, you'll be the first to know when the next chapter drops. Remember, your voice counts here. Whether it's a question, a reflection, or even a challenge, I'm excited to hear what you have to say. Let's make this space a place where we all feel heard. Thanks again for being here, and I can't wait to see your comments.